Hi, good to see everybody. There is a new sheet on the back table for next week's study. It gets us into chapter 4 of James. If you're interested in that, today we will be covering the last section of James chapter 3. So let's be turning our Bibles to James 3. And we are looking today at James 3 verses 13 through 18, a section dealing with wisdom. And if you don't have a copy of the notes for today, I think there are a few extra ones floating around in the little shelving unit on the back for James chapter 3 verses 13 through 18. But the one on the table is for next week. That gets us from chapter 4 verses, about the first 12 verses of chapter 4 next week. All right. The first thing we want to do is we want to read the section, and then we'll go back through and take a look at our discussion questions to get us through the text. So let's start in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. All right, so today I think we have around 3 questions to kind of get us through the text. And the first one is more generic. The second and the third kind of get us specifically into some of the bulleted points that James lists in verses 14 through 18. But here's the first question, number 1. And this deals with verse 13. How are we able to know by someone's life if they are wise? And he clearly says in verse 13, let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. How do you look at someone's life and tell if they are being wise? How do we do that exactly? What was it? Oh yes, look at their actions. Can you look at some actions on the part of people and say, that is just foolish? Can you look at some people and say, that's just foolish? And as much as we could say that someone is foolish acting, well, by contrast, we could do the same and then conclude that someone was acting wisely. Go back to the beginning, chapter 1. What is wisdom? How did we define that? I think we had some discussion on wisdom. What is that exactly? Yeah, Joel? Okay, and that's it. So are we able to look at someone's conduct and determine through their conduct that they're applying knowledge the right way? Yeah, we can do that. So James is talking about a practical observation on our part that someone is not acting foolishly but acting wisely. Now, I didn't include this in the questions, but did you? I know you read this part this week. You were looking over your questions. Do you see a connection in this section with what he just finished talking about in the preceding verses? How did he start chapter 3? You're welcome to go back and look at chapter 3. What was his warning in chapter 3, verse 1? Remember verse 1? What did he warn people against? All right. Was his warning, don't become a teacher? Okay, so he's clearly not telling people, don't ever try to be a teacher. What's the warning, though? Okay, if you're going to assume the role of teaching, you better be prepared and qualified for that role. Do you see a connection now in verse 13 to that role? Should a teacher be wise? Should there be some experience involved in that? So in verse 13, when he says, who is wise and understanding among you, that is not disconnected from what he just finished. So now he's talking about, in this section, the needed and central qualification for teachers to have wisdom. And so that's going to be, ultimately, that's his application, right? We'll apply it across the board to some other scenarios, but he's really talking about teaching. He's still in the context of teaching. And he was reminding people back in the beginning of chapter 3, don't be in a rush to be a public teacher, you know. It's not just a role that everybody should take lightly and just assume lightly. Not everyone should rush into it, and then not everybody should still even then be a public teacher. In essence, James is now saying, who is a skilled teacher? Who is that? Well, he answers it in verse 13 by saying, those who have good conduct and their works are done in the meekness of wisdom. Do you see in the Bible, if you reflect back in Scripture, is there a connection between wisdom and teaching in the Bible? Especially, for example, if you read the book of Proverbs, is there a lot of connection between wisdom and teaching? Yeah. So you have a lot of connection between the two. And sometimes in the New Testament even, just like in the Old Testament, a wise man, where the Bible would refer to a wise person, it was used sometimes of learned people or people who were like teachers or philosophers. You see that sometimes even in the New Testament. Jewish teachers were sometimes called wise men. All right, so there's a connection between wisdom and that. So let's take a look at verse 13 more carefully. He says, first of all, who is wise? Right, and we talked about wisdom. Joel just offered the definition. It's taking knowledge, but it's being able to use knowledge in the right way. It's a sort of an applied knowledge in this sense. But here the idea would be he's skilled, he's expert in something, wise in a practical sense. And then he says understanding, right? He connects the two, and understanding here would be intelligence. But the idea is that wisdom and knowledge go hand in hand because teaching requires both of those. So it might not be the best illustration, but I was just thinking, because I was working on the notes, I kept thinking of Don and Darty building a house. You're going to build a house, okay? You need materials. But what do you also need to go along with the materials to make sure they go in the right place? You've got to have a contractor. You've got to have somebody who has a practical knowledge of how these pieces of the puzzle fit together so that it brings the picture. Both are necessary, but in and of themselves, a contractor without materials, does that do you any good? What about materials without a contractor? Doesn't do you any good. You have to have both of those. Well, in a sense, wisdom and understanding or intelligence go together because you have to have knowledge, but you have to have the ability to apply that knowledge in the right way. And he does so in this passage. He shows that. How? How do you understand that a person has both of these qualities? How do we discern it? By his works, by his lifestyle. He proves it. The teacher does, but all of us do. The teacher does in this passage by his good lifestyle. So if a man claims the experience necessary to teach, right, chapter 3, verse 1, if he says, I can be a teacher, well, he should prove it by his godly life. Have you ever heard the expression, practice what you preach? That's this verse. All right, so he's talking about practicing what you preach. Because where wisdom is, there should be good work, good conduct to follow behind it. He does mention in this passage to do it in the meekness of wisdom, which means that there's a humility that comes out of wisdom that should characterize the teacher's lifestyle. But I think if we were to, if we sort of broadly push that out and get beyond the context of teaching, it's pretty easy to look out in the world and assess the world and say, you know, Sometimes we do things wisely, but sometimes in the world people act really foolishly. Sometimes their actions are just foolish. And wisdom, you know, Joel mentioned it's an experienced knowledge. It is not infallible. Wisdom is not infallible foresight. But wisdom is a kind of foresight, right? It's the ability, it's sort of like common sense reasoning. Like if you're going to make a decision, wisdom is the ability to say, if I do this, then this is the consequence of that. You do something extremely dangerous, don't be upset if you get hurt as a result of doing something extremely dangerous. Wisdom is the ability to look at the end of that and say, here's the consequence of that. If I just shut my phone off and don't open my bills and I just refuse to pay my bills, that's so foolish, because eventually somebody's going to come collect on that money, right? So there's a practical wisdom that is evident in a person's lifestyle. And if we connect it to teaching, James is saying, look, if you're in a rush to be a teacher, you better prove it by your lifestyle. You better practice what you preach. You better believe and practice what you're telling others to do as well. So verse 13 sort of still connects us to the overall and the overarching context of teaching. All right, so now here's where we get down to, Art, sorry. And that's something, yeah. That's right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, they depend upon each other, but you can't have wisdom without knowledge, but it's possible to be knowledgeable and not be very wise, and I think we see that a lot. Let's take it back to I've got some hands going up. Joel and then Tom. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is. It has to be accurate. Yeah, knowledge is essentially no good unless we know how to use it. But the knowledge has to be there in order to use it. It has to be the accurate application of that. Tom, go ahead. Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah, yes. Yeah. 2 Timothy 2:2, we looked at that, I guess last week, and it said, you have to be faithful and able. And there are very knowledgeable, wise people who just don't really have the ability it just doesn't fit their personality to do that. Yeah, they just don't want to, and so some people don't, but that doesn't make them any less wise or knowledgeable. That's true. Let me give an example. I was thinking, Art got me to thinking about this. I have known a few preachers in my lifetime, and some I've known very well, friends who stood up when it came to preaching on sexual sin, right, and preached against sexual sin. Is that knowledgeable? Is that true? Should we flee fornication according to the Bible? Right? And then those same men have often met and counseled by themselves with just another woman in the room and ended up in real trouble over that. Was that very wise? And that's incredibly unwise. So to Art's point, it's possible to know the truth, right, and sometimes not apply it very well. And when you can stand up and you can say, flee fornication, leave it. And when you put yourself in a position where that becomes a possibility, that's not really wise. And there has to be the both of those. They play off of each other. So I think those are great comments. Okay, question number two. There is such a thing as worldly wisdom, right? So we have a contrast here between heavenly wisdom and worldly wisdom, beginning in verse 14. There is such a thing as worldly wisdom. What does this wisdom look like? So James is going to give us some qualities of that. And do you think that we're witness to much of this today? When you read verses 14, 15, and 16, do you see a lot of what's in those verses? Do you see it? in the world in which we live, and not just in the world. Do you see it sometimes in the church? So let's tackle the first part of this, verses 14, 15, and 16. What does it look like, this worldly wisdom? You can either summarize or give an application of it. What does it look like when we're reading these verses? What is worldly wisdom? Your thoughts on that? What do you think? What is it, Gene? Okay. That's a great, Congress would be a great application of that. Almost anything politically. Interestingly, though, there are some words that have some interesting connotations that sort of lean toward, at least in word picture, political, strife, and we kind of see that there. If you're reading these verses 14, 15, and 16, how would you summarize this? What is worldly wisdom? Yes, Miss. It is. That's right, Miss Jo. It's loving our input more than the input of God, and it's setting your affection on things of the world. I think Joe's exactly right. It's just affection for the world, and it influences the way we think about things. All right. So in this passage, he starts out with two qualities or two effects of worldly wisdom. In verse 14, he says, bitter envy, and then self-seeking. And you may have, if you're reading King James, you may have a different translation there, but you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts. And then he says, don't boast and lie against the truth. So let's talk about bitter envy. This is the same word, by the way, that appeared earlier in the chapter 3, verse 11, where he was talking about a spring and the impossibility of a spring to bring out fresh water and bitter water. So when you taste it, it's just offensive. It's harsh. And that same word is now being used to describe the effects of worldly wisdom. Envy, interestingly enough, is the same word that we get sometimes zeal from, but here it's used in a terrible sense. So the idea in bitter envy would be contentious rivalry or jealousy, just plain old jealousy. And we see that as part of the works of the flesh in Galatians 5 and verse 20. If you put this in the context of teaching, right, because generally applied, any of us could fall prey to this. Have you ever seen rivalry between teachers in the church? It happens. And not just teachers. Have you seen rivalry within a congregation? And that's what he's warning against here. Jealousy between people who are supposed to be companions in the Lord's work. Have you ever known people to vie for position or to love the applause of people in a congregation that they would nearly do anything to put themselves in a position to gain that? I'll give you a great example of that. Matthew 6, verses 1 through 18. In those passages, he talks about Jesus does when they give alms, when they pray, when they do their charitable deeds. Why did they do those things? To be seen of people. And they didn't care who in the world they ran over to make sure that they were in a position of popularity and plaudits. That's what they wanted. And he's warning against that, but that is a characteristic of worldly wisdom. When we value, like Miss Jo was saying, when we value our own surmising over the Word of God, it almost inevitably leads to some sort of a rivalry where we think our think-so is better than everybody else's, and we vie for a position. So he says, watch out for bitter envy. And then he talks about self-seeking. Now, Gene mentioned, interestingly, politics, but it sort of has that application. Self-seeking here literally means selfish ambition. You have, I think King James has strife here, but there were so many shades of meaning here. It means a hireling, a selfish person interested only in wages, a partisan, that's what the word means, or one who resorts to evil measures to accomplish one's desires. And in classical Greek language, the word that's used here literally meant unethical, political seeking. Right? So you could certainly apply that in a secular sense to the politics that we see all over the world, but especially in America. Right? You see this a lot. But in the church, this happens too. Tommy? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so you have 3 John, you've got Diotrephes listed there, and he just wanted to manipulate and control. He even resisted John and some of the apostles of the Lord, and so it happens. It really does happen where there's sort of this political seeking in the church, which is the product of worldly wisdom. All right, so in the context, he is warning, certainly across the board, generically, any of us, but he's warning would-be teachers about these positions of influence and sometimes the danger inherent in those positions of influence, or at least the temptation that is involved in that. But that would apply across the board to elders and deacons and teachers and preachers and song leaders. Any position of influence in a congregation could become political seeking if we're not really, really careful. And you get me started on this. I have strong pet peeves and strong feelings about politics in the Lord's church. I hate that stuff, but there's politics in the Lord's church, and there are some people. I could put names on it. I'm not going to, but there are some people who are just plain old politicians. And they glory seek. They think they put a price on themselves where they think they are the premier people, and they walk in a room and they expect to be noted for that, and that stuff has no place in the church, right? Because we're all brethren, we're all equal in the Lord. We stand on the same footing. There's no one better than another person. But he's warning them that worldly wisdom produces this kind of effect. Now, he warns them at the end of verse 14, when these things are there, he says, don't boast and don't lie against the truth. And there's nothing more boastful, right, than our own wisdom when we think that we're smarter than everybody else, and pride loves to boast. So he's warning them against that. And then he says, don't lie against the truth. And the flavor here of that would be something like this. When we're boastful and we injure other people, right, when we're self-seeking and we're jealous and we're creating these divisions, don't purport to love the truth. That's his point in this passage. We are being false with truth if our conduct is opposite of what the truth is. So we can't be God's man if we have fallen for the trap of the world's wisdom. All right. Now, in verse 15, he moves to talk about the origin of it. So why does it produce that? Well, verse 15, because it's not of the world, or it's not of God, right? Verse 15, it's of the world. This wisdom does not descend from above. It is not heavenly in origin. Instead, it is earthly, sensual, and demonic. So let's tackle those 3 words there. First of all, he calls it earthly. And just as we would reckon from that word, it means it's generated from right here. This is our own think so. It's limited to just us and this world. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul goes against the wisdom of the world. Remember that passage? He says, God crucified his son, and in the wisdom of the world, that's an offensive doctrine. But he talks about how limited the wisdom of the world is because it comes from us, our own reasoning. It's unguided. It's not objective. It's individual. It's superficial. It's temporal. That's what earthly wisdom is. Then he calls it sensual. And it's interesting because the word here literally means natural or belonging to the animal life. It means it's governed by base desires. It's not guided by anything objective or beyond this universe. And to Miss Joe's point, it's just a life guided by lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. That's what this is. That's what this wisdom is. And finally, he says it's demonic. Now, this is interesting because earlier in James 2, he talks about demonic faith. What does he mean that this wisdom is demonic here? How could it be demon-like wisdom? Yeah. Yeah, okay, and I think that's it. I think Tommy is exactly right. It makes us like Satan, the way he acts toward God and the way he interacts with others. It just makes us like him, right? It's sort of assuming the same pattern of behavior as even the demons. So his application here is a lot like James 2, where he's just saying faith can be demon-like, and so can behavior. Behavior can be demon-like as well. We end up resisting the Lord's will by this. And at the end of that, he says in verse 14, or verse 15, or verse 14 rather, he says, if you have bitter envy and self-seeking, then he says there is in verse 16, confusion, and every evil thing are there. So he sort of returns to that main idea and says, if you have this type of wisdom, don't be surprised when you have instability and disorder and every evil thing, meaning it's good for nothing, right? It doesn't do anything but cause bad things in this world. So he gives us a synopsis of worldly wisdom. Now he gets to heavenly wisdom. So number 3, in contrast, what does heavenly wisdom look like in application, right? So remember, he started the passage by saying, you show it by good conduct. That's how you prove that you're doing the right thing. You're practicing what you preach. But now it has a certain style to it. It has some characteristics. What does it look like in application? How do we get to this point, right? Is it just an instant transformation, or do these things come over time? How do we get there? So in verses 17 and 18, when you're looking at the wisdom from above, what do you get from that? What's your thoughts on verses 17 and 18? Well, let's just take a look at verse 17. First of all, he says, and I think it's interesting, he offers us an order, right? What's the first thing? It's got to be first pure. What does that mean? All right, undefiled. It is that. Yeah. I think it's without defilement. It's undefiled, like Dad said, but it's an attitude of that, right? We're trying to the best of our ability to be like God, because when we're required to be holy, in whose image are we trying to be like? God's, right? The Lord, because in 1 John 1 and verse 5, there's no darkness in Him at all. So we're trying very desperately to be like Him. And the idea is that when we are living in wisdom, right, to what Joel was saying earlier, the accurate application of knowledge, right? Taking knowledge, but you're applying it correctly, it leads to a certain kind of life. If you're looking at a person, and it doesn't mean that we're infallibly wise, right? It doesn't mean that we're infallible in our knowledge, but it does mean if I look at somebody, like I'm looking at you and I see your behavior and you're doing some good things, you're abstaining from bad things, and you're trying really hard to do the right thing, can I make a conclusion about your lifestyle? If I see the purity of your life, what can I conclude? By whose wisdom are you trying to live? By God's wisdom. You're trying desperately to live by heavenly wisdom. And the first notable characteristic and the step in all the others that follow behind that is purity. We're trying to live right. We're trying to reject sin, and wisdom produces a pure life. All right, so there's the first one. Number 2, in contrast to the strife and political seeking of heavenly wisdom, if it's first pure, what does it then lead to? Peace. Is peace something, not just in the world, but in the church, is that something we should strive for with each other? Is it always the case? Sometimes people war and fight among themselves in the church. What's interesting is he'll go through all this, and when he gets to chapter 4, verse 1, go ahead and look at that passage. What's he going to move immediately into next thought when we get there next week? What's he going to tell them? Stop doing what? Stop your fighting among yourselves. And he's very pointed when he says that. He's basically saying, stop fighting with each other, because that's what they were doing in the church. And what that means is they didn't have that practical heavenly wisdom working in their life. But he says if you're first pure from heavenly wisdom, then it's going to lead to a peaceable life where you're trying to resolve issues. And to Art's point, that's largely an attitude, isn't it? I think it's interesting, at least twice in the New Testament, the Bible will say something like this: if possible, live peaceably with all people. What is that admitting? Not always possible to live peaceably with all people. Sometimes people don't want to live peaceably with each other. And in the church, sometimes there are cantankerous people who don't want to be peaceable. But there's also an implication that if you try and both parties are willing, you can live peaceably with each other. And so we ought to try to do that. In other words, if we're seeking heavenly wisdom, right, we're trying to apply knowledge in a very good way, like God presents it to us, then we're all going to be working on unity. Our goal is to try to be together in life and not apart from each other. We're not seeking division, we're seeking unity. And like Art said, again, it's a lot of that is our attitude. If we have the attitude that I want to live right and I want us to get along and do the right thing, And then we'll work on that. And then he moves, number 3, to it's gentle. What does that mean, gentle? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Doris? I think so. I think that's a way of putting it. There's a kindness that comes out of heavenly wisdom. And the word can mean, sometimes it means forbearing, right? You're not overlooking faults. You're not trying to just sort of dismiss the faults of other people, but you are able to bear with people in their weaknesses. We're being fair and reasonable in our dealings. We're not harsh. We don't look from a superior perspective down on other people. We're just trying to be down to earth and kind with other people, but that is a product of heavenly wisdom. Here's another one. This is a big one. I think none of these you can't have. You can't have the absence of these first ones like pure and peaceable and gentle and not get the other. But sometimes there's not this in the world. Willing to yield. What does that mean?
Not always having to have your way.
Okay, you don't always have to have your way. Now, we read these verses. There's an understanding here that when we read these within a congregation, does somebody have a say-so in a congregation? Elderships have ultimate authority within a congregation. But even from an individual perspective, right, elders, even deacons, preachers, Bible class teachers, anybody, right, if he's applying this in the sense of teachers, it would certainly be applicable. But across the board, should all of us be willing to yield? Right. The word here literally means open to reason. Should I, at any given time, be willing to sit down and reasonably discuss something, even if I'm wrong about it? Should I do that? Tom?
I just wonder if King James says, easy to be entreated.
Mm-hmm.
That means you're willing to listen to.
Yeah, you're approachable.
But I don't know that necessarily means willing to yield.
Well, I think it means the same thing. I think it means that you're open to reason. I think that might be a better translation. I like the idea of easily entreatable because it means what it means is you're approachable. You're approachable. I know for a fact, if I put this in the context of a teacher, he's saying if you have heavenly wisdom and I have aught with you or I have a question about something, I know that I can come to you and talk to you about it and you'll hear what I'm saying. And all of us should have that quality. Terry, did you have your hand up? Yeah, give benefit of doubt. The idea of willing to yield would be willing to yield to what's right? So if you come to me and we're discussing something, I'm always going to mold myself to the truth. And that's a quality all of us should have.
Paul told the Ephesians, be kind one to another.
Yeah.
So therefore there's a command. But one thing I have noticed in the last generations or so is how defensive people get right off the
We're very
bat.
defensive.
They're not approachable.
Yeah.
And for some reason they think that they have to defend themselves against everything.
Yes.
And I don't see that's the way that God wants us to be.
Yeah.
So, sometimes we just need to keep our mouths shut and move on, rather than coming back with something to try to defend ourselves.
Yeah, if you didn't hear him, Tom is talking about sometimes these days we're just very defensive. Don't you dare question me. And I have known some preachers over the years, right? Because I try to keep this in the context of where I can see him making this application. I've known some folks, if you dared talk to them after something they said, just had a question, well, you're going to get your head bit off. They were not kind about it. That's not heavenly wisdom. Should preachers or Bible class teachers or anybody, any teacher, right, in the context, should someone be able to walk up to that person, man or woman, later and say, had a question about, and there be a good discussion about that? Should elders be entreatable people? Yeah. Should deacons be entreatable? All of us should be entreatable. None of us should be so defensive, right? Now, we're going to defend truth, right? But we're going to do it in a way that we can still have a conversation about it, and we always have the position that if I'm wrong about something, I'm going to change. I'm going to mold to the truth, and that seems to be the idea here. Bob?
Yes, 1 Corinthians 13 has the whole thing.
That's it.
But,
That's it.
yeah.
giving benefit of doubt, believing the best about each other. That's what love is, and I think love does that. I think you're exactly right. Gloria?
I get the feeling that this is also including opinion items.
Sure.
I mean, not necessarily that you yield on doctrine, but when it's an opinion, be willing to yield to what
Yep.
somebody else wants to do. It doesn't always have to be done your way.
That's exactly right.
And so many times we get ourselves all bent out of shape.
We do. We're
because
defensive, like Tommy said, even over opinions. I mean, we roll up our sleeves and we're ready to fight over an opinion. It's a hill that a lot of folks are willing to die on, for an opinion. And if it's just an indifferent matter, you can even go along with somebody else's opinion and still not have to believe it. You just have to be peaceable about it. But I think you're exactly right. We're sometimes we're so defensive, we're not willing to yield on things. Following behind that, full of mercy, right? Meaning goodwill toward others. There is a desire on our part, if we're living like the Lord wants us to live, to sort of relieve the burdens of other people. We're willing to do that for others. We're full of good fruit. That's the next in order. That means our actions are good. Good fruit follows a life of mercy. If we're willing to be merciful and show kindness to other people, there's always good that follows from that. And then he finishes that list with two things. He says, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Interestingly, the word here, without partiality, means there's a lack of uncertainty. And I'm not so sure that he doesn't sort of draw in the first chapter when he's talking about a double-minded man just kind of going from side to side. You can certainly go back to chapter 2 and pull in the partiality that was being shown by those people in chapter 2 and say that one prohibits the existence of the other. If you have a lack of uncertainty, it's not going to lead to discrimination like in chapter 2. But there's no partiality. There's no wavering in the way that we apply the truth. Our wisdom is consistent across the board, and that would then mean we're not treating people differently. We're treating them without partiality and then without hypocrisy. It means that we act the same in every situation because the knowledge is true, so we know how to apply the wisdom in that situation. We're not two-faced in our dealings with others. We're practicing what we preach, to go back to the beginning. And finally, he comes down to verse 18 and says, now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And that means that a righteous life of good deeds is what is reaped by the one who sows it in the right ground. Peace is the right habitat for producing good fruit. And the point is, in this passage, if somebody's not righteous, and if it's not being sown in peace, then he should not be a teacher. Right? So this is sort of an extension of the first part of the chapter, saying that some people shouldn't be teachers. And it's not, we should all be. And Joel and I had this conversation, I think last week after class. It was Hebrews 5. You were pointing out that, where he says, for the time you ought to be teachers, right? There comes a time when everybody who's a member of the church should be a teacher in general, but not everybody should teach publicly. And there's certainly some things that would limit a person from doing that, and one of those is the absence of heavenly wisdom. If they're not a wise person in the sense that they're applying these things and they show these good qualities, then they probably shouldn't have that position. But maybe James is talking about some who were trying to rush to be teachers, and their life it didn't match the message they were wanting to preach. And he's saying there's got to be a connection between the two. Any thoughts on this? Yeah, Steve?
See that hypocrisy. I always think of Acts 1:1, where Jesus began to both do and teach.
That's it. Do and teach. And you got to do one before you got to do the other. There should be harmony with the message before the message is preached to others. And certainly hypocrisy can undo a lot. All right. So next week, James is going to say, verse 1 beginning of chapter 4, stop your fighting. And he'll tell us how fights start. And it's interesting, he says, why am I hearing about fighting among you? That's within the church. It shouldn't be, but it does happen sometimes. We'll talk about how we stop infighting in the church, and there's some simple solutions for it next week. Thank you for your good input. Can't wait to hear what your input